Good afternoon. Let's get started. Thanks for waiting. We wanted to make sure everyone who's coming had an opportunity to join us. So welcome, I'm Andy Agel. I'm the city's Director of Housing and Economic Development. And I'd like to welcome you here today to talk about the minimum wage. So let me give you a little bit of background. In June, the City Council directed city staff to prepare an ordinance that would increase the minimum wage in Santa Monica to align with what had been approved just before that by the City of Los Angeles. What council directed us to do was to do some outreach to the business and nonprofit sectors. In particular, the council asked that we seek expert assistance regarding the impacts and considerations that are associated with the City of Los Angeles's discussions. We're fortunate that Dr. Michael Reich has agreed to come speak with us about minimum wages and his experience with the City of Los Angeles's considerations, as well as his broader experience in studying the anticipated impacts of increases in the minimum wage. And I just want to make a quick side note because I think there was some confusion about this. So our understanding as staff is that the minimum wage will follow the same schedule that's been approved in Los Angeles. I think there was perhaps a notion that we might go somewhere different, but our understanding is we'll be aligning with the City of Los Angeles. And some of the alignment issues, when council discussed this, they did express an interest in aligning with how Los Angeles handles tipped workers. So I know that's a concern for a lot of folks. At least initially, that's what they indicated. And there's still a couple of open issues that Los Angeles is dealing with. One is the issue of paid sick leave, and the other is the issue of special considerations when there's a union contract in place. So Los Angeles is still discussing those. We anticipate that the Santa Monica City Council will be discussing those issues as well. So in addition to today's meeting, we held a similar meeting last week, and then on September 8th, we'll be holding a meeting that's specifically focused on the unique needs of nonprofits. We anticipate that we will return to the City Council in late September with an ordinance for their consideration. And at that meeting, we'll include summaries of today's meetings as well as the previous meeting and the next meeting. So questions, comments that come up today, we'll make sure those get to council. For those of you who'd like to be informed of when this goes to City Council, be sure to sign up on the sign-in sheet. We will first, we'll send you a link. We've got a web page about the issue. The web page includes some studies that were done, in particular studies of the Los Angeles minimum wage proposal. We also, right now, you can watch the video from last week. We'll have the video from today as well as the video from September 8th. Those will all be available on our webpage as well as the PowerPoint presentation. So for anyone you know who can't attend, I encourage them to take a look at the website, or if you want to see what happened at any of the other meetings we held, please do so. So a couple of quick housekeeping items. There are restrooms if you head out left and then left to the open corridor. There's restrooms and drinking fountains out that way. There's a few other city staff here. Gigi Decavalos-Hughes, who's the Director of Finance. We have Stephanie Lazicki from the Finance Department, Jason Harris from Economic Development, and Jennifer Taylor from Economic Development. And they may be helping with anything that needs to be done today. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Reich. So Michael Reich is a professor of economics at the University of California, and he's the director of the Institute for Research on Labor and Employment, known as the IRLE. He received his PhD in economics from Harvard University. His research publications cover numerous areas of labor economics and political economy, including the economics of racial inequality, the analysis of labor market segmentation, historical stages in U.S. labor markets and social structures of accumulation, high-performance workplaces, union management cooperation, and Japanese labor management systems. The Berkeley IRLE team has won widespread national and international recognition for its many rigorous and influential studies of minimum wage impacts, including from the White House and from the U.S. Senate and House committees. And Dr. Reich's work is recognized as among the most important academic research on the economic impact of minimum wage laws over the last 2 decades. Dr. Reich, with his IRLA team, worked on both a prospective study of Mayor Garcetti's initial minimum wage proposal, as well as an in-depth analysis commissioned by the LA City Council's Economic Development Committee. A peer review of his study, as well as two other major analyses of the proposed minimum wage, concluded that the UC Berkeley study provided the best supported and most reasonable assessment of the minimum wage's likely impacts for the city and region. In addition to work on the LA study, Dr. Reich and his team from Berkeley carried out an analysis for the city of Seattle on the impacts of local minimum wage laws on workers, families, and businesses. And they prepared analyses of proposed minimum wage laws in Oakland, San Francisco, and San Diego. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Reich.
Thank you, Andy. I'm happy to be here again. If you were here last week, this will be an improved version, but pretty much the same, so feel free to take a nap from time to time. As Andy said, I'm the expert that's been called on to give you some understanding of how minimum wages are likely to work, how they are likely to work in Los Angeles, and how they're likely to work in Sacramento. Here's an outline of what I want to cover today. And talk about what the Los Angeles minimum wage ordinance is, the one that was passed, which is a model, as Andy said, for what Santa Monica is proposing to do. And to tell that's just to kind of lay the context. I'll talk about how our study looked at the impacts on Los Angeles' workers, businesses, and the local economy, which will also be a bit of a tutorial on how economies absorb minimum wages, through what channels. And then the last part of the talk will be on comparing Santa Monica to Los Angeles, that they're obviously totally different in sizes, like the elephant and the flea, and they have different compositions in their industries, and we'll take that into account in wage levels, and we'll take that into account in looking at likely impacts on Santa Monica. But I haven't done a full-fledged study of Santa Monica. We don't have data at that local level, so this is just going to be suggestive. I think the general discussion of how these laws have worked in local areas, including our analysis for Los Angeles, is pretty instructive for Santa Monica. Otherwise, I wouldn't be bothering with this. I'm an economist, so I will be talking about the broad economic effects. The session on September 8th by my colleague Ken Jacobs, who's specialized on healthcare and nonprofit issues, will be talking about that then, because there are a number of interesting details in what Los Angeles is doing in the case of nonprofits. All right, first of all, the wage schedule that was passed by the City Council in May and signed by the Mayor Garcetti, I think in June, and which Santa Monica, as you heard, is going to follow. First of all, it does not take place, it does not even begin for almost a year, on July 1st, 2016. The minimum wage will go to $10.50. However, on January 1st of 2016, in about 3.5 months, the state minimum wage is going from $9 to $10. So it's not going to be an increase from $9 to $10.50, but an increase from $10 to $10.50 a half year later. And then it goes up in the amounts that you see here. In 2017 to $12. Let's see if this comes out right. 2018 to $13.25, $14.25 in 2019, yeah, and $15 in 2020. Organizations, profit-based or non-profit-based, that are excuse me, they're eligible under the size criterion of 24 or fewer employees, can ask for a delay for 1 year, or will be delayed, I guess, for 1 year. They don't have to ask; they'll be given a delay, reaching $15 by 2021. So that means each of these targets will be just postponed 1 year. So there'll be a differential until 2021 when everyone's caught up to $15. That's very similar to what other cities have done, such as Seattle, except Seattle had a much bigger employer size exemption. Nonprofits that are concerned with the disadvantaged, primarily. That means not, say, Kaiser Hospital, which is a nonprofit, or University of Southern California is a nonprofit. But organizations that are directly working with the disadvantaged or get most of their funding from government grants and get, I think it's and, not just or, can apply for an extra year, and that's the part that Ken Jacobs will discuss in detail next month. Indexing to inflation will begin the year after everyone's at 15 in 2022, and the plan is to use a 20-year rolling average of the local consumer price index, which means that it will change, the indexation will change very slowly each year, because the previous 19 years each year are still the same. And inflation has been higher in the past, say 20 years ago, than it is today. So this is likely to lead to a more generous indexation formula than other cities have adopted, which is usually the current amount of inflation. Inflation now is running a little under 2%. It was about 2 to 2.2% for most of the last, as an average for the last 10 years. There are no exemptions for tipped workers in the Los Angeles law. In that respect, the city is following state law, where there's no tipped credit. And as far as I know, all the citywide minimum wage ordinances that I know of have do the same thing. They follow the state law in that respect. Okay, so that's the proposal. Oops, go the other way. In our report, first a brief one for the mayor and then a very detailed one we did for the city council, we examined a somewhat different proposal from the one that the city finally adopted. We were looking at the effect of 1325 in Los Angeles by 2017 and 1525 by 2019. So the final bill is a little different. It's calling for $15 rather than $15.25, not a big difference. And the timing is by 2020, not by 2019. Again, not a huge difference. So I think the numbers that I'm going to present to you are close to what we would calculate if we recalculated everything, but that would be a lot of work, and the payoff from it wouldn't be worthwhile, I think. So you'll get certainly a very good idea from our numbers. The coverage of the law, it does include every employer, no matter how few employees they have, whether they have 1 employee or 1,000. It covers both private and nonprofit sectors. It covers only the private sector, pretty much. It excludes federal, should have written on here, federal and state employees, and some local employees, like the LA Unified School District, or I suppose the Santa Monica Unified School District. I'm not sure what its status is. City employees are covered, though, because the city has jurisdiction over its own city workers. It excludes the in-home support service workers who help with the people who have disabilities and who are living at home. They are paid for primarily from county and state funds. So that's another wrinkle here that people who are concerned with that sector will have to deal with. So what I'm going to be talking about when I use the phrase covered workers is just the ones in this group. We left out, in other words, most of the public sector workers and all the IHS workers, of whom there are quite a few in the city of Los Angeles. Okay. So this chart, it's not so readable, but because it's got a lot of numbers on it, but it's basically telling you how we calculated the number of workers who would be affected in the city of Los Angeles. And you go down to the bottom, the 2019 number, you can see we have 609,000 workers would be getting increases. So these are not just workers who are covered, but those who are affected by the proposal. 511 of those, we estimate, are workers who would be brought up to $15 an hour, because they're now paid below that, right? Somewhere presumably between 9 and 15. And then another 98,000 are workers who are now paid at 15 or maybe slightly above 15, but to maintain some wage differentials, they would get some increase. We call that the indirect effect or the ripple effect. That ripple effect, I think, goes up to about 1650 or so. It doesn't go all the way up. The wage distribution basically goes up maybe one or two ladders in the way, in the occupational or supervisory ladder. So the next columns down here, put this in percentage terms, this number, 41.3%, will be getting an increase. This is really enormous. This is bigger than any other city that has had a citywide minimum wage increase, or even the states, or the federal increases. They've been more in the, until the last few years, most of the increases have been in the range that have covered or given raises to maybe 6 or 7% of the workforce. When San Francisco passed its first citywide minimum wage in 2003, we calculated that it was going to affect about 10 to 15% of the workforce, which is a bit higher, but then the new increase that San Francisco has passed to $15, we think will affect something like 25% of the workforce, and this proposal is well above 25%. So it's very bold in the number of workers who will be affected, and that's because there are a lot of low-wage workers in Los Angeles, more so than in San Francisco, where you can't. And we're talking about people who work in the jurisdiction, not who necessarily live in the jurisdiction. So if you're a commuter in Oakland but you're working in San Francisco, you're covered. If you're a resident of San Francisco but you commute to Oakland, you're not covered, or you're covered by Oakland's minimum wage. The same is true in Los Angeles, that it covers the workers, not necessarily the residents. And of course, there can be a big discrepancy between those two, especially in the case of a small city like Santa Monica that has high living costs. So everybody in California has high living costs. So, so in this range, I think this comparable number is about a third for Chicago, which raised the citywide minimum wage to $13 recently. And so this is becoming kind of, even though LA is kind of out of the extreme, or the frontier of this, it's becoming the new normal. It's not 6 or 7%, but 25, 30, 35, 35%, and now 41%. I couldn't calculate this number for Santa Monica because we don't have data at that local level to know what the wage distribution is of workers who work in Santa Monica. It's just too small an entity to give us statistically reliable numbers, and I wouldn't begin to guess how much it is. And later on I'll give you some other data that suggests it might be a lot smaller than LA. Okay. Gotta learn to go the right direction. What's interesting about minimum wages is that they don't increase costs in all industries by the same amounts. And that's because industries vary quite a bit in their average pay and their use of low-paid workers. Restaurants account for the biggest share of minimum wage workers, 17.3%, and these are figures for Los Angeles, by the way, but they're very typical of what we find in other cities and nationally. At the same time, a large percentage of the workers in restaurants are also, if you kind of look at it that way, are very low wage. It's over 20%, I think. So healthcare and social assistance, that includes categories like childcare, retail trade. These are people who would be getting increases, not just who work at the current minimum wage. Sometimes you see, especially in the Bureau of Labor Statistics, data on how many people work at the current minimum wage. That's pretty useless because it's not informative to know who gets exactly $9 or $7.25 nationally. What you want to know is how many people are going to get an increase if the minimum wage goes up 10% or 20% or so on. So I usually use the phrase low-wage workers or minimum wage workers to refer to people who are near the minimum wage, not just right at it. And it gives you, of course, a much bigger number. So, so these industries account for, I think, about half of all the minimum wage workers by themselves. All right. In last week's episode, I was telling you that minimum wage workers are concentrated in a few industries. This next slide talks about our estimates. Can you hear me in the back all right? Yeah. Yeah, good. Okay. This next slide talks about our estimates of what the actual increases will be for the workers who are getting increases. Not for all the covered workers, but for the affected workers. So what we estimate, for example, is that in the first, well, let's go to 2019, which is actually going to be 2020, that by the end, the hourly wage increase will be $2.73. Now, what to notice is that's not $5. It's not like going from $10 to $15. It's a little more than half of that, right? And why is that? It's because, first of all, the people who are paid below $15 today are not all being paid let's say $10 or $10.01. Some of them are being paid $14.99 today, or $12.50, right? There's a whole, what we mathematicians call a smooth distribution or even distribution between 10 and 15. So you expect that the average increase is only going to be about half of the range, right? So bear this in mind, because I'm going to talk about it in the next slide and show you some magic tricks. And then when you do the actual cumulative percent increases, it's about 30% in that calculation. But these are pretty close to each other, so I'm not going to worry right now about what the difference is. All right, so that's the takeaway that I wanted you to think about for this slide, because we're talking about an increase from $9 to $15. What's that in percentage terms? 67%, right? It's yeah.
What about those, as you just mentioned, those that are getting paid, 14, 50?
Yeah. No, those are included in this calculation. This includes both the direct and the indirect increases. Okay, because everyone is going to get an increase. Not just so some of them. The point I want to get to is here, that 67% nominal increase from $10 to $15, $9 to $15, or you could say $10 to $15 would be a 50% increase, is going to become just a 0.9% increase in the operating costs of businesses. And it's like, how could that be? So I want to go over this step by step. It's the first time I did this calculation, which was about 10 years ago, I couldn't believe it, and I had to do it, about 10 times before I finally was convinced it was right. So first of all, there's as I said, an increase to $10 in 2016. Then you take into account that there are phase-ins. There's a phase-in. We're not going to $15 overnight. We're doing it over a period of 5 or 6 years in some cases, some laws. And there are going to be wage increases in those years anyway. All right? Wages aren't going to stay still, just even if there was no law passed. And they have been increasing. Low-level wages have been increasing about 2% per year, as has inflation. It may be a little lower this year, or a little higher. Even though we're in the 6th or 7th year of recovery, we haven't seen an increase in real wages, meaning wages corrected for inflation. That's not a good thing. If wages were to increase more than inflation, then our scenario would look a little different. And in the report, we talk about different scenarios. What happens if there's continuing stagnation in wages? What happens if there's some increase in real wages? Usually, as the recovery gets stronger and stronger, and there are fewer unemployed workers looking for jobs, we start to see real wage increases. Employers start to complain about shortages, but the ones who really want to fill the jobs, the vacancies, raise their pay. The others just complain. So, okay. So that also is going to cut this number from 67% to a smaller number. Some workers are already on track to earn more than 15 or more than maybe 1650 would be a better way to put it, including the indirect workers. That's what I probably should have written here. So they're not. So they may be below 15 or 1650 today, but they wouldn't be by the time the law was implemented. And what we're doing, in other words, we're doing what economists call a counterfactual. The baseline that we're using is what would happen without the law. all right? There would be some wage increases. Then, as I've said, the workers who get the increases, most of them are already paid over $9 today, or over $10 after January 1st. There's a smooth distribution all the way up to $15. There's not spikes or discontinuities. And so that means that the average increase is going to be quite a lot less than the mandated increase in the minimum wage. If you don't follow this, I can repeat it again, because this is really critical in understanding this little magic trick I've got up here. Then there's savings in recruitment and retention costs, or declines in turnover, which a lot of statistical analyses, including some I've done, indicate happen with the increase in the minimum wage, and those save employers 15 to 20% of the payroll increase, because their recruitment costs go down. It's easier to fill a vacancy, basically. The vacancies are filled faster, and there's less training, and orientation for new workers, even for low-skilled workers. These aren't completely get in there and do the job in 1 minute. It takes some training and growth and experience over time, especially including how to handle the non-routine problems, like when the oven shuts down, right, or something. Okay, so that cuts the cost. Then you have to look, and you're looking at the increase in operating costs. Labor is not, or wages, payroll are not the only element of operating costs. There's rent, there's materials. Materials could be the food in a restaurant, the tablecloths, the paper menus, whatever. And it turns out that the payroll share of operating costs is about 23% on average in the whole economy. In restaurants, it's higher. It's about a third. And of course, the minimum wage might increase that even higher, and we take that into account in our calculations. In retail, it's a lot lower. It's only 11%. And so in an industry where the labor share is low, an increase, that is the payroll share is low, an increase in payroll doesn't have the same impact on your operating costs, right? Okay? And so when you kind of multiply all these things, or take all these things into account, and we've checked our arithmetic quite a few times, we calculate that the overall increase in operating costs in Los Angeles for all industries was about 0.9%, all right? Not 67%. It's a huge thing to understand this difference. Then we make an argument, and we say, I say here, it's higher, much higher in restaurants, like 7.8%. Then we have an argument from economic analysis and also from statistical studies of how restaurants and other industries raise prices after a minimum wage increase. And we find that the increase in operating costs is fully or almost fully passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices. So this would increase the consumer price index for Los Angeles over the time of the implementation of 0.9%. So that's over 5 years, and that's compared, as I said, to CPI of about 2% per year. Yeah, question?
I just have a quick question how you got to the 23%. Is this assuming that all subsidiary costs in the supply chain are stagnant? So for example, the guy...
Yeah, if buying food at the produce market goes up because of the minimum wage, then that should be calculated in the restaurant's change in operating costs. But that's so small because it's you're looking at a couple of percent of a couple of percent. So it's not really put into here, but it could be. It could be. It wouldn't come out very different.
Okay.
Okay. That is to say, the most of it's the direct labor costs that really matter. Indirect ones that are think about the fact that a lot of the inputs, the non-labor inputs, are coming from elsewhere, not necessarily produced in Los Angeles, for example, or in Santa Monica.
So it's safe to say that a business that uses exclusively local vendors would have much higher increases, correct?
I wouldn't say much higher, a little bit higher.
Could you define
Because,
that at all? Like,
well,
does that have some kind of
Frankly, I'd have to calculate it, but it's just my intuition is the following, that each of these other items is a small percentage of the operating costs. So rent is the next biggest item, okay? There's no reason for rent to go up because of a minimum wage increase. The rent for the store or the restaurant. And then we're talking about some inputs that are manufactured where, like the tablecloths, where labor is a very small share of operating costs, right? And produce, even, locally grown and so on, it's, I don't know, maybe 40% I think is labor, but you're only increasing that by, you have to do the same calculation for and so you're getting a couple of percent increase in that times whatever that small proportion is. So labor and rent are the two biggest components. After that, you're talking about individual items that just don't figure that much in the cost. That's why I think it's logically, you're logically correct, but I think empirically it's just not going to be that important.
Have there been any studies done?
There have been studies done on how to, that use these fancy input-output models to try to work this through. The Department of Agriculture has done these, and so there's a study called A Dime a Day, I think it was, which calculated this for going up to 1010, the old federal bill, which said it costs most people a dime a day in food costs. So it came out with pretty similar numbers. But thank you for reminding me. That's, Okay?
Thank you.
All right, let me go on. So as I say here, you get down to 0.9% overall, but it's higher in restaurants. So these are kind of just one-time increases, by the way. I mean, by one time, I mean during the period of implementation. After that, there's no further increase in every year in restaurant prices, but they're just permanently at a somewhat higher level. Okay, so all right. So here's in our report, we look at this for individual industries, not just overall, particularly the high-impact industries, meaning the ones that have the highest amount of minimum wage workers. So here's my 0.9% and my 23% that was on the previous slide, and then down here I have this for food services, which is a little broader than restaurants. It also includes cafeterias and food trucks and so on, but it's dominated by restaurants as a classification, a statistical classification. And you see the percent increase in payroll would be 20%, but the labor share, it's not a third anymore, it's gone up higher because of the previous increases in wages that we're taking into account here. This number is still probably high, because this number is probably still is a little too high. It includes management labor in it, as well as kind of the workers who would be getting the increases. And then so you get this number of 7.8, and the biggest impact, in other words, is in restaurants. So that's not a trivial number. Can restaurants afford 7.8%? Well, they'll tell you that their profit margin is like 5%, right? And so this looks like something that isn't affordable, but they'll go out of business. But when an industry as a whole is affected by a mandated wage increase, the response is going to be different from if one firm faces an increase in costs and nobody else does. The difference is, and we teach this in Econ 1, we don't just teach that demand curve slopes downward, we also teach that prices vary, and will vary on depending on the supply side costs. And what we have found, as I was saying before, is that price pass-throughs occur. And so, surprisingly, there's not much impact on profits, we think. There's a little bit, maybe, because with the increase in prices, there's going to be a decline in sales. Sales will fall more in a full-service restaurant than a fast food restaurant because demand is more price elastic. That means that consumers respond more to a price increase in full-service restaurants and in limited-service restaurants. That is to say, if prices go up, they might go downscale, down market, not go to a fancy restaurant, but go to a fast casual or a fast food restaurant. And okay, so this, whoops, I still can't get this right. Here I've got some other examples that are all quite small, not negligible. Look at retail trade, which has a somewhat large increase in payroll costs. It's not as high as in restaurant. I'll take your question in a minute. It's not as high as in restaurants because wages are higher in retail trade than they are in restaurants. But then look at the labor share of operating costs. It's only 11% or 12%. And so when you multiply that through, the increase in operating costs is actually quite small. And again, phased in over 4 or 5 years. Again, on a base of 2% or 2.4% increase in prices that are occurring anyway. So I don't think it's really even salient enough, noticeable enough to affect demand, but it might affect it a little bit. Okay. This slide looks at the impact by firm size, and the only thing I would say about it is that smaller establishments, smaller firms are affected more. The percent of workers getting a raise is higher in small firms than in large firms, and this simply reflects the fact that there's a big correlation between wages and firm size, which many labor economic studies have found. And there are quite a few different reasons for it. It doesn't mean that small firms are more vulnerable. It could mean that, but it doesn't necessarily. That requires a kind of separate analysis of the profitability of firms by firm size. Okay, so stepping back from these kind of data analyses or data adjustments, data points, let me talk a little bit about how minimum wage affects the economy as a whole. And so this will be working toward how to sum up all the effects, the different channels of effects on the economy, in this case the LA economy, from a $15 increase. So I've got this sweet little animation here. I've already talked about this, the reduced employee turnover and improved performance, because you have workers who are more experienced and been on the job longer. We can quantify the savings from employee turnover. It's not 100%. I'm not saying that employers could pay, that if they raise their pay, it would pay for itself, right? That's not the case, though some employers are taking steps nowadays to raise pay in order to reduce their turnover. Some individual companies are doing that. Improved employee performance, we're pretty sure that occurs because we also can correlate it with things that we can quantify, like reduced absenteeism or increased morale when we do a survey, but it's very hard to put an actual number on it, so we're not really sure how big it is. It could be substantial, but it might not, and so we don't put that into the calculations since we don't know what number to apply to it. Okay. On the right here, I wish it was this one. That I should have switched this in this. All right. Automation, the substitution of equipment for labor. This is the one that we hear about the most. That John Boehner said in response to President Obama a couple of years ago, when Obama proposed raising the minimum wage, he said, well, that just cuts the demand for labor. If you're going to have a higher price for labor, you're going to demand there are going to be fewer workers who are employed, because everyone learns in Econ 1, or even if you haven't been to college, that when the price of something is higher, you're going to buy less of it. I buy less beef when the price of beef goes up, and I'll buy chicken instead, right? So it isn't the same thing applying here for labor. And the answer is that that's theoretically the incentive that's created, but how important is it in practice? To what extent is there a substitution of equipment, or as we say, capital, for labor? And this is something that hasn't been studied very much in the case of restaurants. It has for the economy as a whole. Generally, we think that these elasticities, the substitution, how fast equipment gets substituted, is actually pretty low. And it seems to me they're very low in restaurants, and they're somewhat higher in retail. Because in the last 20 years, we've had an experiment. We haven't had the price of low-wage labor go up so much as being proposed now with these minimum wages, but we have seen the price of capital go down quite a bit. That means if you borrow money, the real interest rate is close to zero today, and has been for years. It was 5% 20 years ago. The price of capital goods has gone down by a factor of 10, mainly because computers are cheaper and they're used in everything now, and Moore's law applies that computing power goes up, doubles every 6 months or 9 months, and so industries have responded to the relative price of capital getting lower compared to the relative price of labor. That's, from an economic point of view, the same incentive as the relative price of labor going up while the price of capital stays the same, right? If you shook your head yes, you get an A in Econ 1, So what we've seen is a lot of changes in retail, more use of capital, more use of data management systems, Walmart using terabytes of data, for example, big box stores that have emerged and really transformed retail. In restaurants, not so much. Around the edges, certainly in the business side, that is management of inventory or accounts, use of the internet, big increase in the use of the internet because menus get posted, you make reservations on OpenTable or whatever, is popular nowadays. You can order food online on Grubhub. Anybody here use Grubhub? Yeah, I never even heard of it before I did this work, but it's very popular, and there are others competitors, right? And so all those things save on labor, but very little has affected in restaurants has affected the preparation of food. Again, on the edges, there's been some changes in food being prepared outside the location and so on, but pre-prepared, but there's not been a huge effect. The restaurants are about the same size as they were 25 years ago. You don't have the emergence of big box restaurants compared to before, especially not in fast food. And labor share of operating costs hasn't fallen because of these changes. What does that tell me? It tells me that for the time being, that the opportunities for further substitution of capital for labor in restaurants are pretty limited. And in fact, there is a machine out there, a robot out there that's on Momentum.com that will prepare a hamburger and put all the finishing touches on it according to your order, and then put it in a bag, all done by a robot. But it's been around for 10 years, and not a single restaurant that I know of has actually bought it. So it must be either very expensive or the food's not, I don't know what his problem is. But it's just an example of how difficult it is to automate these things. So it's not just a question of the economic incentive, which is what John Boehner was talking about, but actually, what are the technological possibilities? Now, 10 years from now, it could be that someone has made breakthroughs and that all these jobs will disappear. But they will anyway, not just because of minimum wages, but because of the technological changes. Just as in agriculture, most jobs disappeared, not because of the rising price of labor in agriculture, but because technological change really did diminish demand for agricultural labor. Or some people are saying, or not saying, but it's clear that the same thing is happening today in manufacturing. But can it happen in these non-routine, non-routinizable services? That's the question. And for other sectors like the care industries, like child care and elder care, where human interaction is the key, right? Then it's not clear you can or want to mechanize those very, very much, and that there's a lot lost when you try to use a robot to take care of a child. A robot meaning in this case a computer screen, and that's so that's a special not a special situation, but So in these care services, which tend to be very low wage, child care workers are unbelievably low paid, you're probably not going to see much automation outside of the business side. And this is not just my opinion, this is culled from reading the literature and talking to experts in the field. Okay, so that's that. Now the other, whoops. Okay, now this box, which really should come after this one, but so as I've said, there'll be some small increases in prices, 0.9% overall in the LA economy, 7.8 I think was the number for restaurants. That will produce some decline in sales. There's no question about it. It depends again on how consumers respond, what we call the elasticity of demand, price elasticity of demand, which is technically smaller than 1, which means these are relatively inelastic commodities. So in other words, if you are talking about a product that's really a basic necessity, you have to buy it whatever happens to the price, right? Whereas if you're talking about luxuries, then they're going to be much more price sensitive. They'll be income sensitive too, but they're also going to be much more likely price sensitive. So most of the things that we're talking about that consumers buy are relatively inelastic, which means that the sales decline is real but not as big as the increase in prices. So it's and then the fourth box is that there's increased consumer demand. So many advocates of minimum wages focus just on this one point. They say the economy is going to be stronger, there'll be more jobs created because we're putting money in people's pockets, right? And these are people who spend everything that they receive in more income, which is true. It is true that if you have, if you look at the consumption patterns of people in the bottom half of the wage distribution, they're basically spending everything that they're getting. And you have to go pretty high up before you start to see some savings. Savings are very concentrated among the top 20 or 30%, 1% of the population. And so if the incomes at the bottom are going up, that compared to what they would have been otherwise, then that's going to create a lot of extra demand because those people are spending and spending locally. Yeah.
A couple questions on that last point. A lot of that spending, though, especially for lower income families, is frankly going to pay off debts and other what I would call consumer spending. And then two, I don't know that a lot of that's big, and you touched on this last week, is being spent in the city of Santa Monica. So that's money that would be then leaving as far as the city's concerned.
Yeah, okay. So let's, this is all the LA analysis, which is the bigger city. That's right. Some of the money will go to spend down debt, but some of the money also goes to increase debt. So for example, the major study that I know of on the effect of minimum wages on consumer spending is by Dan Aronson and his co-authors. Dan is the vice president and research director of the Chicago Federal Reserve Bank. And what they found, and it was published in the American Economic Review, which is a top journal in the United States, very hard to get published in, they found that minimum wage increases led to increases in spending that were 4, 5, 6 times the amount of the actual increase in income, and that the money was being spent to buy used cars, basically through consumer debt, through borrowing. And because they felt the minimum wage increase was permanent and they wouldn't have the capacity. Then in later years, of course, when they pay down the debt, they have, that reduces demand. But generally, there's going to be some leakage out to reducing your debt too. And of course, that'll also depend on how much debt there is. There's less debt today than there was relative to income than there was in 2007, right, or 2008. But the main point here is that there will be increases in demand, in consumer demand, and that these tend to offset the decline in sales here. And all the simulations I did, I varied all the numbers, like what the savings rates were and the employee turnover rates, whatever I did, we couldn't get much difference between these two numbers. And since we think this is going to be pretty small, what you can see from this is that a minimum wage increase, even up to $15, is not going to have a big negative or positive effect on the economy.
In
The
LA,
ad,
not Santa
well,
Monica.
in LA, yeah. Well, I'll come back to Santa Monica. So this is these two boxes are the ones that opponents are concerned about, all right, the most. And this was the only one that the advocates usually mention, but I'm trying to bring in both and say, it's a balancing act, and which way, is it a positive or negative balance in the end? And you have to study that empirically. I don't know, and it can't be done just by making a logical argument. Your point, I think, is that, and this is in our study, is that some of the spending is going to occur outside of the area for local wage increases. So we show that here by looking at LA City and LA County. Now this is before LA County decided to raise the minimum wage, which just applies to unincorporated areas. There are 88 cities still remaining around LA that are still have not raised their minimum wage. So we found a negative effect on employment here. This is LA City of, here, 0.2% of all employment at $15. And a lot of that is because of this leakage, the fact that something like 40% of the workers who worked in LA were in commuters from Santa Monica and from Long Beach and Burbank or wherever. And so that a lot of their spending is going to occur outside the area that we're talking about. But when we looked at a bigger area, Los Angeles County, and this just neglects the people who might be commuting from another county, from Orange County, say, all the way to LA City, I think is a small number. Then the small negative numbers into small positive numbers. Because we're not talking about leakage now, when we're talking about a broader area. So for Santa Monica, there's going to be a lot more leakage, obviously, because it's a tiny sliver of the whole economy. But I'll come to that when we talk about Santa Monica itself. Your other question? Yeah.
Another question,
Yeah.
kind of the same as hers. So it's safe to say there's a small amount of extraction, not only from city to city, but from industry to industry, like you said that.
Extraction? I'm not sure what you mean by.
Like people who are paid more as a result of the minimum wage increase, they don't spend that money within the same industries that pay them more.
No, of course
For
not.
example, they're
Yeah.
buying more used
They,
cars.
I mean, they buy. They tend to. Fast food workers will spend, on average, the same as everyone else, which is maybe 8 or 9% of their income on fast food. Well, 4 or 5% of their income on fast food. So there's a little bit of positive feedback, but it's, of course, they still have to buy clothing and have transportation and everything else. So what I've been doing here is talking about an overall economic analysis, not just on the city, on a particular industry. Yeah.
Also, you talked about wage increases, but for instance, if you took a person making $9 today versus a person making $15.50, if it's a single parent with 2 children, they would actually be making less net take home after considering subsidies and federal and state terms of that.
Yeah. So what you're talking about is that if they're now getting food stamps or they're on Medi-Cal,
Section 8.
or Section 8 housing, they may not anymore be eligible, or the amount that they get in case of food stamps will go down. It goes down by 30% of your increase in income. And I've actually done some econometric studies of how much it goes down. It's not obvious that happens, because if unemployment goes up, then more people would go on food stamps, say. So you have to do a causal analysis, not just look at what the way the administrative schedule is. And we've calculated that in here. It's not on this slide, but it's in the background. Is what the actual increase is, net of increased taxes that people pay and the decline in the public subsidies. So good point, and something I didn't mention, but that definitely happens. People still are better off. They don't lose 100% of their wage increase through the loss in public programs. It's closer to about a 30% offset than a 100% offset. But there's definitely an offset. That, of course, also implies a savings for taxpayers at either the state or federal level. So that does come back in some ways. So basically, what we're seeing here, I think, is that people who work in restaurants, especially fast food, are going to get a substantial wage increase, and the people who eat in restaurants are going to pay a little bit more. Those are two different groups of people on the whole. The people who eat in the restaurants, especially the full-service restaurants, of course, are more affluent and can afford it, and it's a smaller, it's not a big increase in their price, it's a small increase in their price. And I have a chart, but I didn't bring it today, which looks at how restaurant workers' pay in Los Angeles has gone down in the last 25 years, while average workers' pay in LA has increased. And so what the minimum wage does is it restores the parity or the ratios to where they were in 1990, say. It's not that we never had such ratios before, because the inequality has been getting worse. And it doesn't do much else in terms of the level of the economy. It's not a big stimulus on the economy, it's not going to ruin the economy, at least at this levels. If the minimum wage was set to $30 or $40, I'm pretty sure my simulations would come out very differently. And I could explain to you why, but it's not important for today. And it probably would have much bigger negative impacts. But we don't know between 15 and 30 or 40 exactly where that will begin to happen. And this is an interesting period that's coming up where 5 years from now or 6 or 7 years from now, people like me, but maybe not me because I'm maybe on to other things by then, will evaluate these in terms of the actual impacts. These are all proposed, estimates of the likely impacts. And if you want, I can talk to you about how I've evaluated the actual increases in minimum wages that have occurred in the last 35 years and have changed the perception of most economists as to what the impact of those minimum wages has been on unemployment. But let me turn to Santa Monica, which is really the topic here. Santa Monica compared to Los Angeles. Well, let me skip the slide and come back to it. Okay, so in this slide, I look at the size of Santa Monica's private sector compared to LA City. This is an approximation, and so it's I think a 1 to 20 ratio. It's 5% or so. But if you look at the percent who are in accommodations and food services, which is I couldn't break this out in the data that I had, but it's dominated by food services, which is dominated by restaurants in terms of where most of the workers are. You can see that quite a bit more of Santa Monica's economy is in this sector and is true in LA. This 10% is close to the national average or the California average. Santa Monica's is much higher. It's a tourist city with a lot of hotels and restaurants in its and retail in its economic base. On the other hand, when you look at weekly pay, what you can see, and here I was able to break out accommodations and restaurants. Accommodations means hotels and motels, just the term the Bureau of Labor Statistics uses for this category. And the pay is much higher in Santa Monica, pay of the workers, than, and this is all workers, not just low-wage workers, than it is in LA. So 737 versus 648, 454 versus 369. This is probably what, about a 15 or 17 or 18% differential. So this number suggests that Santa Monica would be more affected by a minimum wage. This number suggests it would be a lot less affected. And that's because fewer workers will be getting increases, because fewer are, because Santa Monica is a relatively higher wage city than LA is, even in these lower wage parts of the economy. I haven't done a quantitative analysis to see how it all would work out. As I said, I don't really have the data that would allow me to. But I have thought a little about tourism in general, especially after last week when this came up toward the end of the discussion. And this is a better answer than the one I gave last week, I guess, so it includes some of the components. The first thing is there's a certain number of tourists to Santa Monica who are really tourists to the LA region. They're not coming specifically to Santa Monica, though they may spend some of their money in Santa Monica. And these are likely going to be people from the East Coast or from international visitors and so on, or even people who want to go to Universal Studios and the Santa Monica Pier. not just to one or the other. And so if there's price changes that affect tourism in LA because of its minimum wage, that's going to change tourism in Santa Monica to the extent that people are coming to be touring, both Santa Monica and LA, because LA is so much bigger. So that's going to be in effect regardless of what Santa Monica does to its minimum wage. As I've suggested on the previous slides, the hotels and the retail sector will not be affected to any measurable extent. So I don't see an impact on tourism coming from that part of Santa Monica's economy. I also think that restaurant wages are going to be pulled up in Santa Monica insofar as they're below $15. They're going to be, there are people who work in Santa Monica who can say, well, I could go across the street, in this case, to cross into LA and get $15 an hour. So the employers are going to want to, therefore, not want to, but will be pressured by competition, market competition, to raise their pay. Not necessarily all the way up to 15, but higher than what they otherwise would have paid. And this is not unique to Santa Monica. It's just as true for Compton or Long Beach or Burbank or whatever city we're talking about. Precisely because LA and LA County now are 50% of all the workers in the county. And so you compare a large labor market like that to a small labor market, the spillover is going to come from the large one to the small one. It's not, it's going to be a fairly large upward pressure on pay. So that means that there will be some increase in restaurant prices in Santa Monica relative to Los Angeles, even without the ordinance. So that's, again, using this counterfactual or basis that there's going to be an increase that you should take into account without the ordinance when you calculate the effect of the ordinance. Then the final point here is that some of the tourism that comes to Santa Monica is specific to Santa Monica, and it's because you have such beautiful beaches and ocean views, and Universal City does not, right? So obviously, LA has beautiful beaches also, but to the extent that Santa Monica is more specialized in that, in terms of the component of its economy, then having a beach view is something that tourists pay for. And I would suggest that they are less price sensitive, the people who are doing that, than the average tourist. And so so again, I haven't done a statistical study of this, but it just seems to me that's one of the factors that distinguishes how tourism will be affected in Santa Monica than compared to LA. Yeah. Go ahead.
This is all relative to Los Angeles, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, because Los Angeles has passed its law, right? So Santa Monica is going to be affected no matter what Santa Monica does, right? So I think the impact of the minimum wage ordinance on tourism is probably going to be pretty small when you put all these factors together. A lot smaller. It's just like my magic going from 67% to 0.9. It's probably not going to be, if you're worried about it, I think there's less reason to worry after going through this evidence and this argument. My final thoughts, Santa Monica's wages will increase because of competition with Los Angeles employers. That's, I've said that before, but nonetheless, I think it's good to coordinate minimum wage policies on a regional basis, not to have a lot of different minimum wage rates in local areas. And this is a trend that's happening in other cities too. So San Francisco has had a higher minimum wage since 2004, and now we see Oakland and Berkeley and Richmond and El Cerrito is now considering it, and Emeryville are all, and then down on the peninsula, Palo Alto and Mountain View, and I mean pretty affluent cities, but a lot of them, San Jose, have raised their minimum wages as well. So there seems to be a move to harmonize the minimum wage, not perfectly, but it's going in that direction. In other places like Albuquerque, a poor city which has a higher citywide minimum wage, the county joined into that minimum wage, which absorbed whatever it was really just outside of Albuquerque. In the East Coast, Washington, D.C. moved first to raise its minimum wage up to $11.50 a couple of years ago. I think $11.50 or $12.50. I think it's $11.50, and there's now a ballot initiative in the works to raise it to $15. But anyway, the two counties that border D.C. on the north, on the Maryland side, Prince George County and Montgomery County, independently decided to come up with the exact same number. So, you know, they would never agree that they did it because the other city did it, or county did it. They want to have their own ownership and credit for it, but that is how it's worked out. So I think it improves fairness and it reduces whatever market distortions there are on a border when there's different minimum wages across the street from each other. And I think the same is likely to occur from what I've heard. Santa Monica may be the leader in being the others, the smaller than LA cities to follow LA, but there's going to be others as well that will happen. So that's all I have.
I was here last week as well. Good stuff. The takeaway I'm getting is that it's safe to say that there's no way to differentiate between large business and small business, correct? In the restaurant industry, though, is it safe to say intuitively, as an economist, that full-service restaurants, especially independent full-service restaurants, will be the hardest hit by not only the wage increase, but by subsidiary issues like sick leave, other economic things that affect it? Is that correct?
Uh-huh. I don't know. I mean, it really depends on what the wage rates are in independent restaurants versus, say, chains. And,
Okay.
I think when you're talking about the very top level of restaurants in San Francisco, you're not talking about chains, obviously, and they pay pretty high wages, so they're not very much affected. When you're talking about the average restaurant, not the top end ones, the top end ones are the ones that everybody writes about, then it could be a different pattern.
Right, but for every top-end restaurant like you're talking about, like Per Se in New York or, the French
Yeah.
Laundry, there's probably 500 casual full-service eateries, right? Many
Yeah.
of them in Santa Monica.
Right.
So wouldn't it be fair to say, at least intuitively, that businesses that fall into that category deserve some kind of other concession aside from the wage? The wage is going up, we know that, nobody's arguing. Is
Yeah.
it fair to say intuitively that they're going to be pinched the hardest, and therefore to preserve those anchor tenants of Santa Monica's economy, which is heavily reliant on tourism, like you said, isn't it fair to say that they should at least get some kind of leverage in other areas economically to survive?
Well, first of all, I don't know how many of them are chains versus independent in Santa Monica versus, independently owned. There's probably some of each, and most people think that chains have deeper pockets and big franchise fees that could be part of the adjustment, and that's been a big issue in Seattle, for example, where the franchises were given or not given an extension. And then there's the question of compliance. And I might have mentioned this last week, the compliance is actually lower in independent restaurants than it is in chains, because the chains have a whole corporate system, and they're the first ones to get rated by the Office of Labor Standards Enforcement or Wage and Hour and so forth, and so then they have a uniform policy. So so that's a question here too. Then there's the question of what is happening anyway without the minimum wage and the balance between the small independent restaurants and large chains. And again, I know my view and probably everybody's view is a bit distorted by our becoming a foodie nation, where we're talking about the French Laundry all the time or restaurants like that. And that's not necessarily typical. It could be that, so they're doing very well. Chains can't get up to that level, but it could be at lower levels that the chains are killing the small restaurants apart from the minimum wage, just because their economies of scale, or they can better weather downturns or whatever. So there's a lot of different factors to put into this. I don't.
Okay, and that actually leads into my next
but
question.
But if you look at the other way to look at this is, what have other cities done? And they've, a lot of them have given smaller businesses more time, more phase-in. Seattle has done that. San Francisco did that the first time around, but not this time. Los Angeles is doing that. So I don't know of any that have given tax credits or any other kinds of exemptions to independent restaurants.
Okay.
I mean, I know in my hometown in Berkeley, we give a huge preference to local businesses. You can't even get into my local neighborhood if you're a national chain. There's quotas. It's been around for 40 years, so there are systems that some places have adopted, but
But Santa Monica doesn't have that, as far as you know, correct?
No, well, not quotas. Not that I know of. I mean, there's preference. There can be local business preferences and local hiring preferences. So, at San Francisco Airport, which is a pretty major place, and about 30,000, 50,000 employees there, the restaurants, of which there are quite a few now, are chosen on the basis of being locally owned rather than being national chains. They give a lot of preference to those. So there's still Pete's and Starbucks and so on, but so that's a possible trade-off that I see in policy that's made.
Okay. Last part of my question is, has there been any studies done on conglomeration and its correlation to a higher wage, i.e., do you see a rise in conglomeration as the wage increases in any particular area?
Okay. Conglomerates, which were big in the 70s, 60s and 70s, were when firms went into different lines of business. So General Electric, for example, was not just an industrial corporation, it also was a bank.
For the sake of argument, let's say size then.
Size, okay. So size, yeah, there's definitely a correlation between wages and employer size. That higher, that's very robust in the literature. So the smaller restaurants or smaller businesses are going to have to, and I showed a slide with, showing that this was going to happen, no question.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah, that smaller businesses on average have pay lower wages. It's not, I'm not making this a universal truth. A lawyer's office could be small, an architect's office could be small, and yet pay higher wages. But if you control for occupation and so forth in industry, then there's a very robust correlation between the size of an establishment or the employer size overall and the wage that the employer pays.
Okay.
Even including characteristics of the employees. So that for some reason there are extra benefits to being large.
Doctor, you spoke about the overall increase of the rate going up to $15 an hour would lead to an overall increase in prices at restaurants at 0.09%. Do any of these numbers or increases take into account special factors here in California, like the drought that has already caused beef prices to go up by more than 50%, or regulations on eggs, which has caused prices to more than double?
On eggs, did you say?
Eggs, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, first of all, the number was 7.8% for restaurants, 0.9% overall. So it's a higher number. The answer is no. We're just looking at the changes in labor costs. There could be all kinds of other changes that are going on, but they're not, unless they're being caused by the minimum wage increase. And I'm sure the drought is not going to be,
No, I just wondered.
caused by the minimum wage increase. So no, that those other factors are going to happen anyway. We're trying to just look at one particular policy and leaving everything else the same. Everything else is not going to be the same, but as economists, that's the way we have to do our calculation. Otherwise, you can come up with any scenario you wanted. You know,
Okay.
oh, we know El Nino is going to come, and so beef prices are going to go down. Don't worry about it. Well, you know, you wouldn't be happy if we started making a lot of those assumptions.
Okay, so
Neither would I.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
You talked about a lower rate of compliance among small and independent businesses.
Yeah.
Do you have any theories, whether it's anecdotally or not, about the reasons for that? Is it a lack of education? Is it not having the resources? And then I know other cities aren't doing anything yet proactively, but are there things that you might recommend that a city like Santa Monica do to make sure those
Yeah.
small businesses aren't getting hit with enforcement actions for something they don't quite understand or can't implement yet?
Yeah, that's a very good point. The San Francisco enforcement and compliance policy is really a model, I think, for the whole country, and certainly for every other city, and it's being adopted. I know it's already been adopted by Seattle. And that's to heavily involve the community. And so Labor Standards Enforcement Office actually gives grants to community organizations who are for I don't know, 6 or 7 languages. And you can find this in all the bus shelters, you know, and that information about the minimum wages in different languages, 6 or 7 languages, and employers are heavily leafleted, or however it is that they're involved. And yeah, so that's, I think, a very big part. There's still a part that, you know, employers aren't going to necessarily comply because they're just not used to complying with government policy and just ignoring it. And it creates an uneven playing field. So it's probably a good thing to try to level it. And in San Francisco, there have been some targeted efforts. You know, so okay, we'll go more into Chinatown or the Mission District, which was Latino, but also we can have complaints coming from these community organizations as well. And when a complaint comes in San Francisco, the investigation that occurs does not involve just that one employee, but all the books for all the employees, which I think is a much better way to do things than the federal government does. Its inspections. And then, you know, you get a lot of publicity and you get some fines that are in the newspaper, and those are extremely effective in alerting the other members of that community. That gets their attention fast. And the current chief sheriff at the Department of Labor, David Weil, who I've known for a long time, he's the assistant secretary for housing, for wages and hours, which is the group in labor that federally that does in charge of enforcement. He has studied this issue for many decades and has done some really interesting analyses before he went to Washington, showing that that when there was visible enforcement in one area, a geographic area, say of Boston, that had a big effect on compliance in quite a large swath around it. So that's one way to do education. There's many ways to do education. In Oakland, there's been a lot of attempts to educate the community and say, support our community. They have this big minimum wage increase, so, you know, eat at your local restaurant. And I don't know how effective that's been, but it's definitely very visible. And I encourage that. I think that's a good way. But that some people here have been expressing concern about certain kinds of businesses, and small businesses, and I think also ethnic businesses, immigrant businesses, and they will need some support. Education is one. Another point, which I think I mentioned last week, but I haven't today, is that many of the workers who are getting minimum wage increases, this is not going to apply so much to Santa Monica, but certainly in Los Angeles, are concentrated in neighborhoods that are poorer neighborhoods. I don't know if there are any in Santa Monica, but they're probably different. You know, there's what did George Bush say? There's the haves and the have-mores or something. So anyway, so those local businesses are going to disproportionately benefit from the fact that they're surrounded by people who are going to get much more wage increases than people in say, West LA. Okay.
So one of the initial slides mentioned that City of Los Angeles, probably Santa Monica, will follow this not accounting for heavily tipped
Right.
workers, and I was just curious if other cities you knew of had or hadn't, attempted something like that, if it worked, what your feelings are on the concept of sort of like someone making $400 a night and also getting then $15 an hour or something like that.
Right. Yeah, this came up last week as well, and some people make a lot on tips on some nights, but the average tip worker doesn't make quite as much as that, and is also subject to a lot of irregularity in their pay. So we again kind of get, our eyes get big when we hear about a bartender making that much, say, but it doesn't reflect what the average worker, tip worker gets. Generally, I think most of these cities and most of them are in California follow state law, and state law in California is there's no tip credit, and as I understand it, that's not an issue in Santa Monica. That's that's already been settled, as it was in Los Angeles. There was some discussion of it, I know, beforehand, but the city council elected not to do anything but follow state law.
Hi, my name is Alex. Can you let us know what is the ultimate goal for proposing this additional increase? What's the goal?
What's the goal?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a good question. In Los Angeles, the mayor referred to Los Angeles having one of the highest rates of poverty in the United States of any city, and the highest in California. And he wanted, he saw the minimum wage as an instrument to reduce poverty. Now, it's only an instrument that's good for reducing poverty insofar as poor people or poor families are working families. If you don't have a job, it's not going to help you in the first place, right? So the original minimum wage law in the United States, 1938, the Federal Labor Standards Act, 1938, said it was about creating fair labor standards. There was no mention of reducing poverty. And so the amount that was determined on was 25 cents an hour nationally. And that was not, I don't know if that reduced poverty in 1938, but so it's definitely, the goal is to reduce, I would say, to reduce inequality, which has been growing, and it's been growing in not just between capital income and labor income, but within labor income. There's lots of people who are doing very, very well if you're in the tech field, in San Francisco, say, or San Jose, and people who are doing the services for those people, whether it's personal care services or janitorial or security or working in the restaurants, have not been doing well. So this is, and the market by itself has not raised their wages. So the argument is that the market won't do it by itself, and for 100 years, yeah, that's the argument has been that you need government intervention. And Franklin Roosevelt in 1933, not in 1938, but 1933, the depth of recession, gave a speech in which he said that any employer who cannot pay a living wage to his or her employees doesn't deserve to exist in America. So then the question is, what's a living wage, right? And minimum wage is obviously not a living wage. 25 cents an hour was not. And $7.25 today, which is the federal minimum wage, is not. And the argument is that we can't raise the federal minimum wage because Congress is, too deadlocked. So let's try to raise it at the state level. And also at the state level, there are big differences in housing costs and in cost of living within a state. So that the living wage level, the cost to actually meet, and meet your requirements if you're going to participate in society, are much higher in Los Angeles and Santa Monica than they are in Fresno or Bakersfield, right? And so the rationale here is to make the minimum wage be closer to a living wage for that area. So that's another way to state the goals. And of course, you don't want to at the same time blow up the economy. So I think that's, that's certainly why the economists get called in to score these things.
You said you're gonna obviously we're gonna do $15 an hour, but it doesn't end there because you cannot pay your cook the same as the way you pay your shift leader. So obviously we're gonna have to pay more 17 or 18 to managers and stuff, and vendors probably gonna charge us more for food because they have employees and they also need to increase their prices. And obviously restaurants are making anywhere from 10 to 20% profit in the end. And I read in a few articles in Seattle that what people did, they instead of doing tips, they changed it to a service charge of 15%,
Right.
because it's either that or closing.
Yeah.
So, and by doing that, the employees are actually getting less. Because if they receive their tips, there will be, they'll get much more than 15. So I want to get your take on the service charge and understand the logic. That we personally try to increase it to 12, 13, 14. Health insurance, we really want to pay them, but the math doesn't work. If you go into 40% labor, you have no room for mistakes.
Mhm.
So I just want to get your
Yeah.
take on those two.
Sure. Well, tipping is a particularly peculiar American institution. You don't tip in a restaurant in France or most of Europe. It's included in the charge that you get, in the fee that in the bill that you get. So the law here is a little complicated. A tip, by definition, belongs to the employee, the person who is tipped, the waiter, server, the bus people and bussers and so on. And it's not the employer's to spend. If you shift to a service charge system, depending on how you word it, it's very important. It could become the property of the employer or the property of the employees. And this is not just happening in Seattle, it's also happening in San Francisco and in Oakland. Quite a few restaurants are doing this, and other places around the country. Sometimes it's just a dissatisfaction with the idea of tips, that you're not really paying for the service you're getting in most cases. And in the states that allow a tip credit, there are 43 of them in the United States, customers don't really realize that they're paying some of the wages of the employee. They're not adding to the income of the employee, they're substituting for the wages that the employer would have to pay. That's not the situation in California, but that's part of why some people think it's better to change the system. So in San Francisco, this has been an issue for 10 years, not only because of the citywide minimum wage, but also because there's an employer mandate on health spending that applies. So there are a bunch of employer mandates, and some restaurants, quite a few, have added service charges. In some cases, in addition to the tips, or in some cases now, instead of tips. So one restaurant I know very well said no tips, we're just doing the service charge. So then the question is, who gets the money from that service charge? And it's too early really to give you a pattern of how this works out, because it's experimental at this point, and different restaurants are trying different things. In the early days in San Francisco, there were quite a few restaurants that held on to the money that they were supposed to give to the city's health fund, pay-or-play system, and they were sued, and there was a lot of publicity, and that problem has been mainly fixed. But will a service charge be kept by the employer? Will it be divided equally among all the employees? Will some of it go to the more senior workers? Will it go equally to the back of the house workers or the front of the house workers? I've seen all kinds of different models out there for this. And I think the law is probably not as definitive or as clear as it should be, but I'm not an attorney, So that's just what people who are attorneys tell me. So, but I think there is a problem. If you take all the tips away from the highly tipped workers at a high-end restaurant, and you say we're going to divide that equally among all the workers, that's going to create a wage decrease, earnings decrease for the tipped workers, and some of them may leave. But who says you have to do that? What?
The alternative is to close.
No, the alternative is to try to close the gap between the back of the house workers and the front of the house workers, but not, to be totally egalitarian, right? Or to do it on the basis of merit, independent of occupation, or tenure. There's lots of ways to do it. That because it's the property of the employer, they can set up a different system. The other possibility is to create a tip pool, which is now illegal. The employer can't create a tip pool, but the workers can create a tip pool, and they can decide to share their pay with the back of the house workers. That sometimes happens, more than sometimes. So I think it's a kind of undefined, it's not a very clear situation right now. But it's one where there's a lot of fluidity, and as you said, where there's been a lot of more experimentation with trying to go to a service charge approach rather than a tipped approach. In San Francisco, the restaurants say, and now in Oakland too, they say on the bill, a 5% or 15% charge has been added for employee health and employer mandates. So in that case, I think that creates a more greater willingness to pay on the part of the customers. They say, okay, well, 5% extra for making sure they have health insurance, I'm willing to pay that. There's not been much resistance to that. So there's a lot of, I think, ways this might go, or some are better than others, but I'm not a specialist on this, so you have to find other people who are going to study this more. Go ahead.
So, not as an economist.
Can you go to the microphone though?
Yeah. So, not as an economist for a minute, but as a resident of the San Francisco area, would you argue that a service charge is a valuable tool for a restaurant to have as long as it's done responsibly and clearly?
I'm here as an economist, not personally. I have very different feelings about it than I do as an economist. I like the European system, it's just, frankly. And it's also the Canadian system in many parts of Canada, because it's kind of dehumanizing, I think, the whole tip business.
Okay. Taking that out of the equation, though, have there been any studies on moving in municipalities? I honestly don't know the answer to that question. Have there been any studies on municipalities or states or geographic regions that have changed dramatically within a short period of time from a tipped model to a non-tipped model?
Well, the states vary quite a bit in the amount of tip credit they allow. So in about half of the states, maybe it's less, maybe it's about 15 to 20 states, the tipped wage is $2.13. That's the federal minimum, and it has not changed since 1996, when Bill Clinton signed on to it, unfortunately. And it hasn't been increased since, and that means that the way the tip credit works is if an employee gets half of their income from tips, then the employer only has to provide $2.13, even if there was a $7.25 minimum wage for everyone else. In other states, it's $3.50 or $4.25, and in some states it's maybe as high as $4.75, and in California and 6 other states it's $0. Not zero. It's the state minimum wage. The credit is $0. So we have a lot of variation across the states, and this has allowed one of my colleagues to look at this statistically, and she finds that it has no states that have bigger tip credits, that is, they're down to $2.13. The tipped employees are not better off. They're not. There's not more higher employment because of that factor. And you think about the cities that have very high restaurant, prosperity, like Seattle or San Francisco. There are no tip credit states, and And of course, this proportionally affects women and people of color and so forth. So it's not exactly the question that you're asking, because no one's going entirely to a service charge model, but it's a big difference to go from $2.13 an hour to what $9.32 is this, or $9.56 is now the minimum wage in Washington, the state of Washington, and a bunch of states going up to 10 and then to 11 as we do in California. So that gives you a lot of our methods come from this kind of variation, because we can look at the differences that different policies.
Okay, last question,
create.
promise. Is there any data on discretionary spending in markets like Europe where there are no tips versus, say, a state that does have a tip credit, like say Missouri, where they're getting $2.13 an hour, and most of the income of the tipped workers is in fact tips? Like consumer buying habits.
Discretionary habits of the tipped workers?
No, of the people spending the
Of
money
the
within the
consumers.
establishments.
I don't think it varies.
Probably not.
It doesn't vary from one state to another. The proportion the proportion spent in restaurants is pretty similar across the country. It's very little variation. That's coming from the income, so I'm not sure why it is, but it's not a great variation.
Okay, I lied. Last question. Would you
said that already.
What kind of an economic impact would you theorize if, say, the United States, within the span of 5 years, moved to a non-tipped model?
There are a lot of questions about tips, and I can just say that it works in Europe. I don't know what all the exact ways it's going to work out are, and that it works in Washington and California to have no tip credit, right? And it may be that it's more egalitarian if the service charge is shared equally among all the employees in France, say, which I actually don't know whether that's the case or not, but if it is, then it eliminates the problem that a lot of restaurant owners are talking about.
Right.
So I that's just and this is all relatively new, so we don't have a lot of data to base it on. Okay.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm very for, people being able to make enough money, to make a living.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think that the $15 and the $15.25, proposed price increase, minimum wage, is higher than any city in our country. I do think with the additional, food costs that are going up, especially in Santa Monica, I believe our rent is much higher than any area in, Los Angeles County.
Yeah.
Every area, business owners are being pinched left and right, and
But you have to look at it the other way around, which is that in high-cost areas, $15 doesn't go as far for consumers. The actual wage adjusted for local living costs is going to be a lot lower in Santa Monica than in LA, and it's going to be, and it's a lot lower in San Francisco than
the
in LA.
living cost is lower in Santa Monica.
The cost of living is higher.
Exactly.
So the extent to which is a living wage that workers can live on is going to be smaller here than it is in Missouri that you mentioned or Mississippi.
Yes,
Right?
I agree. That's correct.
So you have to go to a higher level here to take into account the higher cost of living in this area, or in the Bay Area, or in Seattle, or the other places that are doing this.
I agree completely with you. There are a
Yeah.
lot of opportunities. I mean, I personally think that macroeconomically, that a $15 minimum wage, $15.25, is not really the best, even for the city, because with that, I think at the end of the day, a cost-benefit analysis and opportunity costs, there are going to be a lot of employers that are going to be closing their doors, and that in itself is going to create less taxes
Okay.
for the city.
Yeah. Well, let me tell you, I wanted to do this anyway, how we have studied past minimum wage increases. Okay, so, I mean, 40 years ago, most economists would have told you, labor economists especially, that minimum wages have negative effects on employment, especially for teens, who were then 30 or 40% of minimum wage workers, and also in restaurants, because they're the biggest users of low-wage workers. And that this really came out of the theory that the demand curve slopes downward, that if you raise the wage, you're going to just hire fewer workers. Otherwise, that's the only way that people can stay in business. And since that time, there's really been a revolution within labor economics about the effects of minimum wage increases. So, I'm talking about going from $4.25 to $5.15 in 1996 or 1997, or $5.75 at the federal level, or when Pennsylvania was at $4.25 and New Jersey went to $5.15 in that, And one of my colleagues, David Card, who's probably going to get a Nobel Prize someday, and his co-author, Alan Kruger, who was been the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, and he was Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, and he's a very good economist. They went and they surveyed fast food restaurants on both sides of the New Jersey-Pennsylvania border. There's a turnpike that goes right from, it's the same turnpike. And they looked only at a few chains, so they were comparing apples and apples, right? They started calling these restaurants on their own, and then they realized they weren't very good at it, and they hired some elderly woman from the Midwest who collected the data, and what they found was that there was no difference in employment in the places in the county where the minimum wage had gone up to where it had not gone up across the state border. And this was like a shock to a lot of labor economists, but their data has held up under a lot of subsequent analysis of their own. And then I and my colleague Aaron Dubé decided we would generalize this study, because this was a one-time event and just one case, New Jersey versus Pennsylvania. There could have been all kinds of things that maybe made employment grow on the Pennsylvania side, or just think whatever's specific to that area. So we looked at every single minimum wage increase from 1990 to 2012. So it was a lot of on a quarterly basis, and we compared counties that were on opposite sides of the border, where there was a minimum wage differential. Okay, so that would be also, say, eastern Washington and western Idaho. And we also took out of our study some of the states where the counties are just so big that it doesn't make sense to talk about there being really competition at the county level, like California, for example. Or we put them in, it really didn't matter. And as long as we had local controls, we found there was no negative employment effect. And that article has been cited over and over again. It's the one that Andy was referring to that the White House said was particularly compelling, and I've seen Joe Biden in the White House explaining that study to a large group of people. It's counterintuitive at first until you think about the mechanisms that I've been talking about price increases, employee turnover going down. And we have studied it not just for fast food, but also for full-service restaurants and for retail and a couple of other studies. Now, it's true that these wage increases mainly just affected 5 or 6% of the workforce. Now, they didn't go as high as $15 or as high up in the wage distribution. So we say, all of us who Aaron, my co-author, and I go, well, $15 is out of sample. It's not, we can't use a statistical study beyond the range of the data that it was created in. So I've gone to this more structural approach, but I think in the past, there's always been people who thought the minimum wage, any minimum wage increase was too much. And I've got in one of my papers some extensive quotes from Theodore Roosevelt's fireside chat the night before he signed the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, where he said something like, don't let any calamity howling business person tell you that they can't afford 25 cents an hour. And ever since then, every time the minimum wage was increased, the urban people have been saying this. And so some of the arguments against the minimum wage are so generic that they're not looking at the actual data and what actually happened. There are some studies by economists that find negative effects, but what they do is they compare, this is kind of getting a little technical on econometrics, but they're basically assuming that states that raise their minimum wages are a random sample of all the states in the United States. And they're not. They're different systematically. And so if you don't have local controls, and you're just comparing all the two sets of states, you're going to find that minimum wages have negative effects on employment, because the states that don't raise their minimum wage have had faster growth in low-wage employment than the ones who have, but for reasons that have nothing to do with the minimum wage. How do I know that? Because when we looked 2 years before the minimum wage went up in the statistical analysis, we found that employment was falling in the non-minimum wage states. And we say, well, this guy's doesn't have a good set of controls for his treatment being the increase in the minimum wage. Now I'm shifting over into medical, clinical test terminology, which has taken over economics, applied economics. And, the idea is of a drug test is that the treatment group that gets the drug and the control group that doesn't should each be randomly selected, who gets it, or rather, who gets into which, so that they're similar in every way except one gets the treatment, right? That's science when you do it that way. When you compare two groups that were already very different before they got the treatment, well, I wouldn't want to take that drug, somebody tells me it's going to have a certain effect. And that's what these fellows, Newmark at UC Irvine and Bill Washer at the Federal Reserve, keep doing. And they say, oh, there's negative effects. But they don't correct for this non-randomness of the states that raise the minimum wages. And that's true of a bunch of other studies that all have the same defect. And that's why Card and Kruger were so revolutionary, because they were holding constant all these other differences. And why our paper has had a big impact, because it dealt with some of the weaknesses of Card and Kruger being a special case, but they only had one before and one after analysis. We have, 20-something years, I think it was times 4, we have 50 or 60 quarters of data. So, and we don't find big effects 4 years after a minimum wage increase either. So that's sometimes the argument is that, it just takes a while.
Well, I hope what you're saying, all of the business owners, I'm guessing they hope what you're saying is true. But there is one difference from all of the examples that you just, talked about.
Tell me.
Is that we just went through a huge, depression. And I think
That's
a lot of the business owners have just recently started to think about growth and expansion. And I think this is going to definitely hinder the growth and expansion.
Well, now you're talking about something very interesting. I mean, that governments generally politicians raise the minimum wage during good times rather than bad times because of this concern. But when we as statisticians try to compare what the impact is when these things are implemented, which is often a year or two later, and you could be in a recession, we don't see any difference in terms of the minimum wage effect. Now, I have had newspaper people say, well, the employment of teens went way down when the federal minimum wage went up to $7.25 in 3 steps from 2007 and 2009. I said, yeah, but it went down below that, before that too. We had a recession. Of course a recession affects the conditions for business. But you have to distinguish between what the recession does and what the minimum wage does. And frankly, there are some people who say it's never a good time. Arnold Schwarzenegger, to his credit, wouldn't raise the minimum. I mean, he didn't raise the minimum wage at first, but he did once the economy got better. He said, now is a good time to do it. So the unemployment rate is really falling very fast in California. So I can understand your concern, but looking, forward at least a couple of years, I don't see a recession coming.
All right.
Sure. All right, I think, you want to talk to me separately. I'll be glad to talk to you after. But
That's fine, yeah.
Okay.